Hi there, everybody. My name's Eleanor Harvey. I'm the senior curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the curator of the exhibition Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture. It's an exhibition that looks at our obsession with nature, and the object that really brought all of us together was the one that you see us standing under here. The mastodon that stood in Charles Willson Peale's original museum in Philadelphia. The story of how it got here, why it's the centerpiece of this exhibition, and what our various expertise all bring to the table is part of what we're talking about today. But what we have, if you look at this photograph from left to right, is Ariel O'Connor, our objects conservator, who was tasked with making sure that the bones arrived and went up safely. Advait Jukar, a postdoc who is a specialist in fossil elephants, which was immediately useful to those of us wanting to know more about mastodons. Diana Marsh, who worked for the American Philosophical Society, which was where Peale's museum originally was, and who knew all about Peale's end of the museum. Standing next to her and missing from this because he's on husband duty is Matt Carano. Some of you may know him because he is the lead paleontologist behind the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum's Deep Time exhibition, AKA Mr. Dinosaur. And then there's me. So what we'd like to do is welcome all of you to our conversation this afternoon, because one of the things that, really happened when we all started talking to each other was trying to understand how the paths that led us to our careers ended up leading us to this picture under the mastodon. He's a relentless experimenter. This is a guy who did electric eel experiments on himself, galvanization experiments. He was trying to figure out, again, if you hit a frog with electricity, why its leg flipped. So he's experimenting on himself. He was drinking little amounts of curare to try to understand how that worked. He understood that China bark, which is quinine, seemed to work against yellow fever. So, I don't know how the guy survived, because the level of self-experimentation probably would kill most of us. But he did seem to be game to cut himself, electrify himself, drink things he probably shouldn't have been drinking. So, yeah, my guess is he'd be in for all of that.
And on 4 hours of sleep a night, I was told.
Yeah, and coffee, liquid sunshine. So yeah, this is a guy who knew how to live. But I think it was that sort of relentless, restless curiosity that is the center of the show. And in fact, what you see behind me is the galleries we would like to be in, which is where the Humboldt exhibition is, with the mastodon as we installed it. So maybe for our audience, what we can do is sort of start off, this is what it looked like in Germany when they were starting to take it down. They were literally using cranes in order to take apart the mastodon in 5 big pieces. That's how they got it out of their 19th century building, literally walking it down 2 flights of stairs and out the front door, where it got created. Yeah, I looked at this picture and I must admit that, I wondered what Ariel's reaction was going to be when I showed her this.
Sometimes hand carrying something is the safest way. But so Mario told me that the mastodon hadn't moved since 1906.
And that's when this building was open. Yeah, this is a mastodon, really quick. Peale excavates it, and we've got some visuals for that, and it stays here in the United States until his museum closes in 1847, and then somebody hauls it to Paris to sell it to the French king to go into the Natural History Museum, but the revolutions of 1848 sweep through, so the bones and Louis Philippe go to England. The British, in Monty Python fashion, have already bought one, so they're not interested in this one. And it goes on view for 2 years until the German buyer for the Hessian prince says, I'll buy it from you. And he negotiates a sweetheart deal and ships the bones to Germany, where they're first in this prince's castle. And then when his collections are handed over to the state, they go into this building. And literally, it's on the 3rd floor as you walk in up there. And as you said, has been there since 1906 when the building opened. This is the first time it's left there, and it's the first time it's been back in the United States. So yeah, so when we got it here, you know, we're eyeballing the crates and trying to figure out how we're actually going to get this up. And there you see at the top, there's Ariel standing there, bracing the tusks as we're trying to get the head on top of the body, while the body is standing pretty much just balanced on its feet. And then from there, it sort of reminded us of the way Peale got the bones out of the pit in upstate New York in the first place, building cranes and levers and all of that stuff. So Diana, you know, tell me a little bit about what you were doing at APS.
Yeah, so I was there for 2 years as a Mellon funded postdoctoral fellow. They have this very cool program to take recent PhDs and train them in being a curator on a show. So you go from research to installation in a year, which is, as you know, super short. And so while I was there, I was the lead curator on this exhibition called Curious Revolutionaries, the Peales of Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And the APS, which is this very old intellectual society founded in 1743 by Ben Franklin and his buddies, has this incredible collection of archival materials relating to the Peales. It's the Peale Sellers Family Collection. As we would say over and over, 19 linear feet of material on the Peales. And so, yeah, so basically we went through that collection and tried to think about what was the story we were going to tell about the Peales. And so a lot of it was about the same intersection of art and science and culture, and had a little teeny section on the Mastodon. So that's how I got to this nerdy topic.
Awesome. That's just amazing. I mean, one of the things that we had to deal with, I kind of blitzed through some slides, but we had some questions that came up when we were putting this thing up. And one of them was just a very basic question, which was, you know, is it a boy or is it a girl? So I'm going to let Advait handle that, because when I found out, when Matt Carano told me, because I said, do you want to come over and see the Mastodon? And he's like, oh my God, I have this postdoc working with me who would just be thrilled. And so I said, I'm sure we can find a way to get you in. And the next thing you know, Advait's essentially helping us install the thing.
Yeah, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. It was nuts. I think there's a scene in Jurassic Park where Sam Neill tells John Hammond, you have a T-Rex, and that was my reaction to Matt saying that they have the Peale Mastodon. What? This thing is in Germany. How did they get it here? Yeah, it was just such a lucky time for me, because I was in DC at the Smithsonian and I could come and take a look at the specimen. So what you're seeing on the screen now is me measuring the femur of the animal, trying to figure out how much the animal weighed, because you can actually correlate the length and the circumference of the femur. And this mastodon weighed about 8 tons, which is about the weight of Henry, the big African elephant in the rotunda at the Smithsonian. So wasn't as tall, but weighed about as much. So it was a fairly stocky animal. Wow. And then we had this question about, is it a boy or is it a girl? And the way to sex a mastodon is to look at his hips, because their hips don't lie. So what you have to do is you have to look at the width of the pelvic aperture. So Eleanor, can you go a slide ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's Matt and me trying to measure the width of the pelvic aperture, and then you take the ratio of that opening to the width of the ilium, which is one of the bones in the pelvis. And if it's got a large ratio, that means it's got a fairly wide opening, then the animal is a female. Generally for elephants, a ratio greater than about 2.5 means it's a female. This animal had a ratio of 2, which means it's probably a boy.
How old do you think it is?
So based on the state of preservation of the bones, it's probably within the last 50,000 years. Wow. So it's relatively young. Mastodons have been around in North America for, you know, about 4 million years or even older than that. We have these things called myomastodons, which show up in the Miocene sometime around 15 million years. Then you get other kinds of mastodons coming in from Asia, and they sort of keep coming in across the Bering Land Bridge. And the species that we have here, Mammut americanum, first shows up in the fossil record sometime around 2.5 million years ago.
Okay.
And so the Peale Mastodon was probably one of the last mastodons that existed in the US.
Could you tell from the teeth or anything how old our mastodon was when it died?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can tell quite a bit about an animal from its teeth. You can tell what this animal ate, how old it was, based on the kinds of teeth that have erupted in the jaw and how worn they are. This was probably a middle-aged mastodon.
Cool.
Now, one of the cool things about the mandible, which you're seeing in the photo on the left, is that it's completely made out of wood. And they placed the teeth in the mandible, and 3 out of the 4 teeth are placed correctly. The 4th tooth, which is the tooth on the right-hand side of the mandible in the front, is probably not from the same animal, and it's not oriented properly. So I'm not sure what the Peales were doing, because they got a lot of the skeleton right, but this strange tooth in there.
Charles Willson was pretty rigorous about making sure he was digging up bones from 2 different places in Montgomery, New York, and nearby in Newburgh. And this came from John Maston's farm, but there was the Baker farm, which was a second site, and he was very good about not mixing bones. But my guess is teeth were coming in from all over the place because, I mean, George Washington had teeth that were given to him by Michaelis when he was over here as a Hessian mercenary. So I could see that you might end up with the wrong teeth more than you'd end up with some of the other stuff.
You told me that the wooden carving for the lower jaw was pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So they must have had a model of another jaw to go
Oh,
on.
yeah.
Yeah, they had a lower jaw from the other dig that they could template this off of.
Yeah, and people had been finding mastodon remains for a long time. Like I said, the first tooth was found by colonists in 1705. Native Americans had been finding mastodon remains even before that. There's a famous site down in Ohio near Cincinnati called Big Bone Lick, which is where they first found, which is where the French found bones in 1739. And they even drew on their maps the place where elephant bones are found for this one spot, which we now call Big Bone Lick. Jefferson had bones from this site. He even sent Lewis and Clark out west to see if he could find any living mastodons.
Yeah, of course, one of the reasons that Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark, who are over my shoulder here out west, is because he desperately hopes the mastodon is still tromping around the Great Plains and that it's not, God forbid, extinct. And in fact, what we find is that because the mastodon is extinct and because Jefferson's not really excited about that as a national emblem, we switch to what's over my other shoulder, which is Niagara Falls or Natural Bridge or other natural landmarks, which kind of express the scale and scope of our cultural ambitions without being tied to something that is legitimately bigger than any other known vertebrate animal, because we're still 30 years away from finding dinosaurs, so don't get started on that. But Niagara gives you a sense of kind of the enormity of the country. Natural Bridge is its own thing. And as we move west, it becomes Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. And ultimately what you get out of that is the national parks as a whole sort of expressing that kind of connection between the United States and nature and being kind of a chosen people. What's fun about this too, in addition to finding, the bones sort of floating around in basically the moral equivalent of a bog in upstate New York, there's the question about the tusks. And I know Charles Willson, Diana, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Peale excavated it, they found tusks, but they kept fragmenting. And so they couldn't actually put them back together and ended up fabricating them instead.
Right. And there was some, as you can see on my shirt, there was some confusion as to which way they went. So it's very, very interesting. There's this great account of the carnivorous, semi-aquatic beast by Rembrandt Peale, Charles Willson Peale's son, sort of explaining why this thing was this carnivorous aquatic animal. So, which I guess if you're digging it out of a bog, you know, kind of looks like a walrus.
Well, they seem to understand at Big Bone Lick that there were an awful lot of marine fossils along with the mammoth and the mastodon. So they were kind of guessing it used to be some kind of a shoreline. And you can see on the drawings here, the kids, Rembrandt and Rubens, desperately want this to be a carnivore. I mean, first of all, it's bigger than anything else. And now they want it to be fiercer than everything else. And so they're drawing it with the tusks going down. And what amazed me, I love the fact that when you did your show, you made a model with the tusks going down.
Yeah.
And I just tell you, I am so sad that I missed this. How long was this up in the yard?
I think it was up just a little bit longer than the show. So the show was up from April to December 2017. And this is an installation by a local artist named Ben Needitz, who basically decided to craft us a kind of a mastodon in process, sort of evoking the idea of actually what it was like to put it together, using this kind of early comparative anatomy technique.
Wow.
So that was very fun. That's the Jefferson Garden behind the APS, and that was pretty cool to have up, since in lieu of the one from Germany, which is now here.
Well, no, what I love about this is that what it reminds us all, the engraving that's at the top here by Montoul, he went to Peale's museum in 1815, and the tusks were clearly oriented down in the Peale Museum. And I can just see Charles Willson going, kids these days, what is the problem? And of course, by the time he paints the artist in his museum, his great self-portrait, the tusks are back up again because you can't see them underneath the curtain that he's pulling aside. But for about 10 years, it seems like they actually had the tusks pointed down in the museum.
Yep.
Which just, I mean, what it says, I think, and Advait, you probably saw this with Deep Time, is we know what we know and we keep changing based on learning new things, but sometimes we fall in love with an idea that doesn't quite bear out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we learn new things about fossils every single day. Even the big T-Rex, which is on display, the way we've envisioned T-Rex has changed so much from when it was first described in 1905. This was this big upright monster with a dragging tail, and now we know that it was a chunkier animal with his back in line with the ground. And so, and that changes how we think about how this animal walked, how fast it could have run, how much it weighed.
Wow.
Do you know when the first skull with tusks still attached was excavated? When would they have known it was a fact?
You rarely ever find skulls with tusks attached. You often find them out of the socket. So tusks are basically teeth. They're the second incisors, and they just get super long. I think the most complete mastodon skeleton, so the Peale Mastodon was the first skeleton of a mastodon, which was relatively complete, that was found. The first almost complete skeleton was the Warren Mastodon, which is currently on display at the AMNH in New York, and that was also found in the Hudson Valley in New York. I think that's one of the first times that they could actually tell that the tusks went up.
Yeah, and actually Warren is the guy who wrote a congratulatory letter to Johann Jakob Kaup, the buyer for the Hessian prints, to say, I heard you got Peale's Mastodon and you got him for a really cheap price. That was awesome. So interestingly, when we borrowed the Mastodon, we basically made a promise that we would send it back to Germany, that it had left the country legally. It was acknowledged at the time that it was an above board sale, and you know, we're incredibly happy they took such good care of it. Here you see the pictures here. The tusks are made of paper mache. So any of you who are like freaking out that you're looking at tusks that have been cut apart, World War II newspapers, probably the fourth iteration of the tusks. We know that Peale made them out of paper mache for the original museum based on, I guess, the curvature of the fragments that they found. Because they're water soluble, my guess is they've been replaced more than once. We do know that when the British bombed Darmstadt in retaliation for the Coventry bombing, the Darmstadt Museum was laid open, and you could see the mastodon skeleton open to the sky. And the next rainstorm melted the tusks and the top of the head, which was also made of paper mache. So these are post-World War II German tusks, but they were too deeply scooped to be accurate. And so one of the things Oliver Sandrock wanted to do when they lent this to us was to change the scoop on them. Unfortunately, because they did it by cutting it open and then piecing it together, the vibration of being in transit meant that they developed cracks. And here is Ariel looking way too happy at the task of actually bridging those and creating Band-Aids for them so that we could put the animal on display.
I'm smiling, but that was stressful.
because we only gave you like a couple of hours to do it, right?
Yeah, I think you gave me 24, but you know, glue doesn't usually dry that fast.
I know you were a little bit worried when you were holding up the mastodon tusks. Part of that was making sure that they didn't just sort of slam down.
Yep. I mean, what they did with the 1950s paper mache is they cut it. It was really smart. They cut it with cone-shaped wedges they could pull out so they could flatten the curvature.
Oh,
and
wow.
then what they did is they put plastic dowels at each cut and then filled the inside. They wanted something to take up the space but to be lightweight, and they used green spray insulation foam.
Right.
So that spray foam that expands, and so they filled that in. But what happened is when it was shipped, the skull is quite heavy and these tusks are quite light, and so the skull shifted the foam a little bit, just enough to put pressure to crack them, but not all the way. So I couldn't add a dowel. They weren't, you know, completely apart. It's easier to fix things that are fully apart than when they just develop a crack.
This is why we love our conservators, because we basically say, no, you can't do this optimally the way you want to, but we need you to do it beautifully and like yesterday.
Well, it made me realize that we don't often have epoxy in our lab. So I was looking for a glue that would set up very quickly, which would be an epoxy, and we don't keep it around. We mix up our own glues and they're reversible and we know their aging properties, but they take, you know, 7 days to set up. And so we injected, I was able to make a glue that I could inject into the foam that melted the acetone. With acetone, it melted the plastic a little bit. And our our exhibitions department didn't have epoxy, conservation did epoxy.
I remember.
Martin Kotler found some, and we put that on the top, and that cured in about 10 minutes. And then that was enough for me to put Japanese tissue bridges on top of it, and then we painted it out. So
yeah, and I don't have it here tonight, but I've got this great picture of Martin Kotler, who is our frames conservator and who handles objects and mounts, standing on a ladder in between the tusks, very carefully painting it in so that literally when you do get a chance to stand in front of this, you will not really be able to see those pieces of tissue paper. Just a point for everybody. Because of the closing on COVID, we're still unclear when we're going to be reopening the museum, and we encourage you to go to our website, americanart.si.edu, because the banner on the homepage will have the announcement when we know when we're opening and how we are letting people in. But we were able to extend the exhibition through the end of the calendar year. So the new closing date is January 3rd. And what we're hoping is that between now and then, there'll be an opportunity for you to come and actually see the exhibition. We do have a lot of things on our website. I did a 35-minute tour of the exhibition with our videographer, Carlos Parada, who is amazing, who came in, and I did a walkthrough talking about the exhibition. That's up on our website. We have an intro video, a close-up on the heart of the Andes. We've got podcasts and we've got blog posts. We've had a lot of fun with this, and so the website is a good place to bring yourself up to speed before the exhibition actually opens. So, you know, we've tried really hard to make this accessible, short of actually being able to let you in to see it. So.
And what was so cool about this exhibition is that beyond just being an exhibit of a mastodon, we actually got to do some research on this. So Ariel, Eleanor, and I shined a UV light on the mastodon to try and figure out what the original bones were and what all of the reconstructed bits were. So I think the Peales used wood, and they used little, I guess, rivets or screws to actually screw those in.
It's sort of wooden pegs
Or
more than
pegs,
anything
yeah.
else.
I think there's a lot of mysteries we still need to solve about this and about
Yeah.
what the Peales did. And one of the things I'm the most curious about is how they attached these wooden replicas to the bone. Because remember Advait, we took a magnet around the joins and nothing was magnetic with a pretty strong rare earth magnet. So either there's metal pretty deep in there, or they used only wood or even only bone. I think
Bone
in some
pegs,
cases
right.
we made bone dowels, which is
Okay.
fascinating.
Diana, the rumor has always been that it was William Rush, the Philadelphia sculptor who worked on ships' figureheads and stuff, who was tasked with working with the bones from both of the digs. So if you were like on this, you can see almost, it looks like, I think of it in terms of airplane wings, because I'll look out the window onto an airplane wing and see all of the rivets in the wing to hold the pieces together, and I can see all of that in here. But I'm curious to know whether or not that's still the way that they think about it.
I actually don't, I feel like you might have actually gone deeper on this than I did. So you might be the expert in this one.
I know one of the things I think is so fascinating about these fills is he matched the wood grain and the direction of the wood to go with the direction of the bone. So there's multiple pieces of wood, and this photo shows some of those joins, but I think they're intentional. I think it's so that it follows, so that as the wood ages, it will follow the curvature of the bone and the lines.
Yeah.
Well, and my understanding was that Rembrandt Peale in particular was involved in helping to figure out how the bones fit together, because one of the things that's really hard to remember is they didn't really know what they were pulling out of the muck. They kind of figured, okay, it's a mastodon, it's a mammoth, but they literally had to use an engraving of an elephant in order to understand where the bones fit. So I kind of described it as, it's the IKEA set of instructions. You have basically a set of bones and an Allen wrench. And in this case, you don't have the Allen wrench. And so you're literally laying them out, kind of going, I think this goes here, and maybe this is a tibia, and oh, that's a rib. And so the fact that Peale was able to put this together was amazing. And the fact that they had the bones from the other dig site, they had some of the missing pieces, but rather than cobble it together like Frankenstein, Peale was being thankfully very rigorous, setting up two different skeletons. And so he had William Rush carving the missing pieces, partly based on bilateral symmetry and partly based on missing pieces from one skeleton that they had from the other skeleton. So that's that lower jaw that's all wood here, but that was probably modeled off of the real bone piece that they got from a different dig.
Yep.
Yeah, and it tracks with Peale's history. Like he started as this kind of watchmaker and tinkerer and was really interested and became an artist and did all these famous portraits that we see in our American history textbooks. And so I can see where the aesthetics of this and that whole thing with the grain is so perfect, because it's like, he's thinking really critically about how the things actually fit together, looking at these historical examples of elephants, but also like making the thing itself really feel like the real thing. And that just seems very, very Peale.
Diana, one of the things I love about the wooden pieces, especially the femur, the pieces that it's not a part that's missing, it's the entire bone. They're like sculptures. They're so beautiful, but they're not meant to deceive. So you can see chisel marks in them very blatantly. You can see them from pretty far away, but when you step even farther away, it makes a hole. And it's a modern conservation concept we use now. But in 1801, if your marble statue was missing a nose, you'd have a new one made in marble. It's the same material. It deceives, it's to hide. But he didn't. He made it very consciously a separate material. And I love that idea.
Well, what's interesting about this too is when this was in Germany, it eventually got painted kind of a lovely golden ochre color. So you couldn't see the distinction between what was wood and what was bone. A lot like the dinosaurs at Natural History, where they were all sort of had a painted covering. I mean, I remember growing up with those dinosaurs and walking through and thinking, wow, this is all original because it all looks the same. And I remember Kirk Johnson saying when they sent the bones of all of the dinosaurs to Canada for cleaning and remounting, we won't know how much of what we have is real and how much of it is filler until they take that cover off. And what was interesting is when Oliver Sandbrock said, we're going to clean the bones, and everyone, I could see Ariel just basically going, with what? And, you know, everyone's like, you're going to do what to this thing? Because since it's a mastodon, it's not really a fossil, it's a subfossil.
It's a fossil. I mean, the definition of a fossil is fairly loose, but I would call this a fossil.
All right. Well, what was interesting is when they took the paint off, all of the bones are numbered. So these are the ribs on the left-hand side. What we don't know is, were those numbers painted on it in Philadelphia before the skeleton went to France and then Germany? Or were they painted when it got to Germany and had to be put back together? Because left links, they're both L words. We're kind of assuming Peale did this, but that's one of the things that in the cosmic scheme of questions we can't answer that we'd like to, what I'm hoping is between now and the end of the year, that Advait, you and Ariel can figure out some way to, you know, help us figure out whether we can tell the folks in Germany a little bit more about what's bone and what's paper mache and what's mastodon and how old paint might be. And we talked about bringing over an X-ray machine to try to find the original armature. And
yeah, Kathy Hawks from Natural History, the Conservator, and her team, they, as soon as it's safe again and we're able, she's going to bring their portable X-ray over. We have permission to do this, and we'll get a sense of wood and bone. And I'm also fascinated with the paint on the ribs. I don't think you have a photo of this, Eleanor. It's the lower portion of the ribs that are made up of cherry wood.
Yeah, I don't have that.
One of the things that Oliver and his team found when they removed this 1950s paint, they thought that all the paint was gone. And when I started looking at the ribs, that, well, these are still painted. You know, the bottom part is still painted. And Oliver said, no, we took all the modern paint off. But it's a really old paint layer. I think it's even an oil paint layer because it wasn't affected by this acetone cleaning.
Right, I remember.
And it's almost a faux bone paint. It's sort of beige and it's got dots. And I'm wondering if Peale painted it for the parts that were replicas to unify the bone. But then why didn't he do that on the femur? So I'm very curious about this paint layer. And I think, you know, I think we can learn more by taking a little cross section. Yeah. So we can take a tiny piece that's like the size of a peppercorn ground up and mount it in resin, look at it sideways like layers of a cake, and we can try to understand what layers are there and if it matches Peale's paint.
Well, super cool.
In this picture I'm seeing on what would be rib 17L, you can see there's a break where there's a difference in the surface between the area that has the paint and the area down below it. And if you look really closely at the photograph, you can see a little peg that's holding the two together. And this is where bone meets wood to create the length of the rib. So yeah, there's still a lot we can learn about this. What I think is really cool is, I mean, when you think about the fact that Peale put this together, it's the first complete mastodon skeleton. But complete is, you know, part of it is Peale and William Rush, and part of it is mastodon. That when somebody asks me, well, you know, what's this doing in an art exhibition? It's really a mixed media sculpture because it is Peale inventing this beast in advance of Georges Cuvier telling us that no, it's not a mammoth, it's a mastodon. And here's the difference between the two. And so, you know, my question, you know, Advait, for you, this has a different value to me artistically than it might have paleontologically in terms of completeness.
Right, but I think historically it's still the first one, and that's pretty special for paleontologists, for elephant paleontologists, and for paleontologists in general. So I think that's why it's such a special specimen. And with the X-ray, we can actually figure out how much of the skull is still preserved. If you look at the original drawings of the specimen, they only had part of the upper jaw, part of the cheekbone, and all of that seems to be covered in plaster right now. So it's really hard to tell, and that's what I was trying to do by laying under the skull and looking up, trying to see if the palate was real or if all they had left were the teeth after the bombing.
Yeah.
You kind of put those in.
By the way, for those of you, when we are allowed to travel again, you should fly to Frankfurt and go 20 minutes down the road to Darmstadt, Germany, where the Hessisches Landesmuseum in Darmstadt, Germany is the new home of the Mastodon. And it's really an encyclopedic museum. It's natural history, it's fine art, it's architectural models. They've actually got an exhibit up right now. They have a fossil of one of the earliest horses, one of the little ones. They're actually giving it a name right now on their Facebook page. They're cool. Kind of soliciting suggestions back. It's a fantastic museum. They do a really wonderful job. And you know, this is the anchor, but they've got a stuffed quagga, they've got comparative zoology exhibits, other dinosaurs, a whole section. Advait, if you haven't been there, the whole section on fossil elephants is pretty awesome. And I'm betting Oliver will basically monopolize your time in order to compare notes with all of that.
I'm sold. When can I go?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's exactly the case, but that's where it is. You know, the fact that it survived the bombing in World War II is just dumb luck. The building got hit, but not a direct hit. There was damage to the skeleton, but obviously not catastrophic damage, and they were able to put it back together again. But there's some World War II newspapers that have some photographs that kind of make the rest of us cringe a little bit.
I think 1953 is the earliest photo they have after World War II.
Yeah. So we put in a reader rail that talks to you about what's wood and what's bone, and tusks up and tusks down. There's even some fanciful notion that the tusks came out the eye sockets, which didn't get much traction, but is hilarious. And when Peale put this in his museum, he put the skeleton of a mouse next to it in order to have the smallest thing and the largest thing. And I wonder if he intended us to be the middle scale in all of that. So we have a rubber mouse. While we were installing it, I stuck the mouse next to the foot and took this picture, and then we built it a bell jar. And it is now sitting on the edge of the platform waiting for us all to be able to see it. And there's Peale's artist in his museum and the exhumation of the mastodon there with the mastodon so that they're all together. But you know, one of the things that I learned about Humboldt was it's all about networking stuff together. So I have kind of a weird background where I started out college thinking I was going to be a geology major. I was going to do plate tectonics and seismology, and I wanted to do earthquake prediction. And everything was moving to computers. It was all CAD design. It was all math and statistics, and I am ridiculously bad at math. So I was working at Natural History on their basalt collection, which Humboldt would have loved. And their head of education said, if you love art, why wouldn't you want to work in an art museum? And that's when I switched from geology to art history. And that's why I study landscape painting, which is kind of how Humboldt came back into the picture. But I'm kind of suspecting that nobody's story was at age 5, I really want, except maybe Matt. Who at age 5,
these are the pillows his mother made him.
Oh my goodness, really?
Yeah. So my husband has been in love with dinosaurs, had dinosaur sheets when it was like no longer cool, you know, and like high school kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he's one of the few who's like, this is my thing.
Mm-hmm.
Followed it through. The rest of us, less typical, I think.
Yeah. How about you, Diana? How did you end up at the APS?
I started out in art, actually. I was a BFA in visual art. I ended up majoring in photography, but that was a bit of a random choice. I kind of loved art, but I realized I wanted to do museums. And so I actually did a PhD in museum anthropology. It's anthropology, but focused on museums, and did my doctoral dissertation on the Deep Time exhibit in the history of that hall. And so in all of that, I became extremely nerdy about the actual archival sources that, you know, leads to all of this work. And now I do archives. So I've kind of ended up started in art, so art, culture, science, and now the kind of archives behind it. And now I'm headed to University of Maryland, where I'm going to be a professor in archives. So
Wow, cool. All right, Ariel, how did you end up getting into conservation?
Accidentally. I actually, when I was younger, my parents would buy me those kits from the Smithsonian. It was a block of dirt about this big. Do you remember these?
Yes, I
think
do.
Natural History Gift Shop
Yeah.
sells them.
Yes.
And you excavate out all the pieces of a broken pot or dinosaur bones. So I always loved that, and I always loved archaeology, but I thought doing that tiny excavation meant I would be a good surgeon. So I went to school for pre-med. And I got a major in dance because I was a dancer too. Eleanor, I think that photo of me holding up the tests, I'm in first position and I didn't know it until I
You are. You are. I was looking at that with your feet kind of going, okay, I'm
a dancer.
Yeah, there you are.
So I realized at the end of university that I could do surgery on art, and I thought that was fascinating. So I switched and became an art conservator. So it's chemistry and science that I loved, and art history, and I focused on archaeology for a while, and I focused on small detailed things that could fit on my desk. And then when I got to the Smithsonian, my desk could fit in things. So it's a different scale now.
Yeah, it is a different scale.
Yeah.
Advait, fossil elephants.
Fossil elephants were sort of an accident. I was always interested in animals and fossils and the natural world. One of the first words that I could say was humunu kunukuapua, which is the state fish of Hawaii. Because my dad read the World Book Encyclopedia to me. That's sort of the level of nerd that I am.
Nice.
So I went to college and I majored in biology, and I studied frogs on a mountain in Korea. And then I got a master's at George Mason, where I studied the ecology of coral reef fish. So still no paleo. But then I got interested in long-term patterns in ecology. And the only way to understand real long-term change is to go back in time. And so I started to study long-term change in mammal communities in the Indian subcontinent. And turns out India has a lot of elephant fossils. And I wanted to understand how much they weighed. And so I started to study them and came up with a new way of getting at how much these extinct elephants weighed. And then I just got hooked. They were just so fascinating. And there were so many of them. There were so many mysteries that were yet to be solved.
So how much do you think this guy weighed?
About 8 tons. So I went and estimated his weight. Yeah, he weighed about as much as an African elephant.
Wow. Wow. Well, I know when Peale first installed it, based on the drawings, he didn't have any kind of flexion in the joints. It was like it was up on tiptoes to make it as tall as it possibly could be and as long as it could possibly be, because he said something like 11 feet tall and 16 feet long. And I'm looking at this going, we're not quite there, because we've now kind of given it a more, well, Germany gave it a more accurate, relaxed armature for this, but it just, trying to sort of envision this. Somebody asked if it had fur on it when it was in Peale's museum. No.
Mastodons would have looked like this.
There, oh my God, look at that. You got it.
So that's my little Mastodon toy, and that's what it would have looked like in real life.
Okay, that's cool. So deep in my heart of hearts, I had wanted a set of 3D printed mastodon skeletons that we could sell in the store, so that I could have like an entire array of them on my desk, marching off Colonel Harvey style, sort of into the sunset. That clearly has not happened, but at least I keep finding mammoths, but I don't. That's the first mastodon that I've seen, so I am really excited about that. The other thing that somebody asked was whether or not in Peale's museum they would have understood that part of it was wood. And actually, the interesting thing is Peale used red paint to draw a line between the parts that were bone and the parts that were wood. So he was actually using this skeleton as a teaching tool for what we did know and we didn't know. But because he had been collecting fossil pieces from multiple dig sites, in The Artist in His Museum, which is the great self-portrait where he's pulling the curtain and introducing, you can see it through the rib cage of the mastodon there, but I can't zoom it in, sorry about that. There's another lower jaw in the foreground, and I wonder if that might have been the template for the wooden jaw that shows up on this one. But Peale was really rigorous about maintaining what we all want, which is where did this come from, so that we have a fighting chance of understanding its context. And as early as archaeology and paleontology were at the time, I admired the fact that he was rigorous enough to care about the fact that he kept his specimens specific from one site to another site. The second skeleton, which was a partial, ended up in the Peale Museum in Baltimore with the kids, Rembrandt and Rubens. And then most of those bones have ended up at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. There are some that are still at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore, which is where you will find Shorty, who is this guy's first cousin. Shorty is a fiberglass replica of the second Peale Mastodon that came out of the farm in Montgomery, New York. And they have a couple of the real bones and a couple of William Rush's wooden bones. But the bulk of it, if when you walk in there, was done for their Mastodons, Mermaids, and Mummies exhibition in the 1990s. The fact that, you know, this mastodon shows up in Germany, Hans Suess, who's a paleontologist at Natural History, casually mentioned that he knew that this was there. And it wasn't until my friend invited me to give a lecture in Mainz, which is near Darmstadt, that I met the director and the curator. And, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, it's a fossil skeleton. They're not going to lend this thing to us. And the next thing you know, they're sitting down with me in their museum cafe going, would you like to borrow this? And I'm like, are you crazy? And so I'm coming up with all the reasons why this is a really bad idea. Can you get it out of your building? Can we get it into our building? Is this really safe? Is it going to show up as a pile of dust and debris by the time we open up the crates? And at the end of 2 hours, they were still going, we want to do this. And so I have to give them a tremendous amount of credit for the fact that they were the ones who were so excited about the possibility of this fossil coming home and then coming back to Germany as kind of a civic pride gesture to say, we've been taking good care of this in Germany for longer than it was ever in the United States. And that kind of camaraderie between institutions is just something that I think all of us feel, you know, when we all came together to put this mastodon together, it was like a meeting of the minds on all of that. So we've got some questions, and, you know, some of them I've been able to answer along the way, but, you know, I guess, you know, Advait, you were down here for a postdoc. I think you're back in New Haven now?
I will be in New Haven in 2 weeks.
And so what are you going to do in New Haven?
I'm going to try to understand if people had anything to do with the extinction of these guys in the Indian subcontinent.
Oh, wow.
So between 50,000 years and about 10,000 years ago, we had lots of big animals like these big elephants all over the world. In the US alone, you had something like 6 or 7 species of elephants. You had, I think, 3 kinds of mammoths, 2 mastodon, and a gopher. So, and this huge diversity, but they all went extinct. And one of the factors that's been attributed in this extinction is human hunting. And no one has really investigated this in South Asia. So one of the things that I want to do is to look at these old bones and see if I can find any evidence of cut marks or butchery marks, right, to see if people were even eating them.
Now, did you say that is there any way to tell how old these bones specifically are?
Yeah, we could probably carbon date them. We could see if we can find any collagen in the bones, and then see if we can use carbon dating. Carbon dating only goes back about 50,000 years. So if they're older, then we'll get an infinite date, and then we can use other techniques to figure out how old this animal was.
Awesome. Do you know if the American Museum of Natural History has dated the Warren Mastodon?
I'm not sure, but I could look it up and see if they've dated the Warren Mastodon. I would assume that all of these animals are within the last 100,000 years.
Okay. All right. Poor Mr. Jefferson. He so desperately wanted to find them still roaming around.
I know. There was a question in the chat about the colonial obsession with mastodons, and a lot of that was because Jefferson wanted to prove a Frenchman wrong. So there was
Well, Buffon was kind of pushing it hard. Had
Yes,
never
yes, he
been
was.
to the Americas, basically. That whole degeneracy theory was kind of a low point for him.
Yeah.
Yep. And Jefferson said, well, we have mastodons. And in his notes on the state of Virginia, where he compares the weights of animals in the U.S. to the weights of animals in the old world, he's got the mammoth on there because he wanted to show that we still have this. And when people asked him, why are you including this? Because we've never found a living one. He said, just because we haven't found one doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, the exhibit I worked on the year before I worked on Peale was on Jefferson and native languages, because he was sending, along with all this other stuff with Lewis and Clark, he sent out these word lists, and mammoth is on there because he's like hoping if I mail out this word list, somebody's going to respond and say, oh yeah, we have those here, and fill it in. They all came back blank, but.
Well, and Jefferson, actually, there's this wonderful book called Jefferson and the Giant Moose, which is about sending a giant kind of moth-eaten moose hide and skeleton to Buffon in order to basically say, you know, yeah, we've got big things. And Buffon's like, yeah, right, whatever. Okay, you know, you're obsessed, but what am I going to do? My favorite story about, see, Buffon basically said everything in the Americas was a lesser or degenerate form of something in Europe. And needless to say, that kind of got the Americans' backs up. And Benjamin Franklin was in Paris. And the Abbé Raynal, who was this very short man, was one of the proponents of this. And there was a dinner, and there was a lot of drinking, which makes a certain amount of sense. And so Raynal posits this thing, and Franklin says, well, I think everybody around the table should stand up. All of the Americans are taller than all of the Frenchmen. And Franklin basically says, I'm done here. Right to Jefferson, and that is Jefferson's favorite anecdote to counter all of this, which kind of tells you that the more it changes, the more it stays the same. We got a great question in the chat that kind of started us out, but let me bring it around full circle. The reason that this mastodon is anchoring this exhibition is because when Alexander von Humboldt visits the United States for all of 6 weeks in 1804, he has 2 goals. He wants to meet Thomas Jefferson because he's read notes on the state of Virginia. He thinks Buffon is a little off kilter on this, and that the Americas, South and North, are quite wonderful. But Charles Willson Peale is the guy who escorts him around Philadelphia, takes him to the museum where the skeleton is on view, because in his letter to Jefferson, Humboldt says, I know you love mastodons. I love mastodons. I found teeth in the Andes at 10,000 feet above sea level. Can I come talk? And Jefferson is like, well, yeah, come on down. So this mastodon formed, I think, the avenue, the point of introduction for Jefferson and for Peale and for Humboldt. And then when Humboldt is about to leave the United States right after the 4th of July, Peale hosts a dinner for him in the same room with the mastodon, with tables underneath the mastodon, which again is sort of a Waterhouse-Hawkins kind of thing. And so there is this grand celebration, and this skeleton is witness to all of that. So the fact that we were able to bring it back from Germany for the duration of this show was really kind of wonderful. So now we're just hoping we can open it up. So you just kind of have to watch this space. As far as permission, we will ask the folks in Germany for permission before we do anything invasive, but infrared, X-ray, they're totally on board with it. They're hoping that they will learn something from all of this too. And the idea of collaborative scholarship is really what this is all about. Humboldt was all about sharing everything you know, and this is a great opportunity for us to thank the Germans by being able to give something.
They've been so generous with their time, and they're so interested in collaboration. So they've given us permission to take a tiny sample of the paint. We've gotten permission to do all of the imaging that we did. Eleanor showed you UV, and we don't actually need to take a piece off for X-ray. We have a portable X-ray from natural history. So a plate goes on one side, and then the X-ray tube goes on the other, and it will go through the bone. And so we don't need to touch the mastodon in any way to get X-rays.
Yeah. So basically, you know, watch this space. I know that Amy Fox has been really good about putting up in the chat links to the exhibition website. Our Humboldt Symposium has gone virtual, and starting in the middle of September, we will have weekly lectures That'll be me and Andrea Wolf, who wrote The Invention of Nature, which is the single most wonderful and readable Humboldt biography that's out there. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list. You will not have any trouble finding it. It's a wonderful read. The book for this exhibition is out, Princeton University Press. You can order it from them or through your favorite independent bookseller or on Amazon. And there's plenty of scholarship on Humboldt out there, but this is the first one to really tackle head on the legacy of 6 weeks in the United States and the implications for this country developing its cultural identity as a love affair with nature. You know, it's been great because this exhibition allowed all of us to spend time together. It means that we'll be back again when we start doing the next round of tests on the skeleton. And it means we've forged friendships that I hope, like Humboldt's and Jefferson's, are durable and last the rest of our careers. So, you know, thank you guys. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of all of this, because I've learned so much from talking to you and from hanging out with the skeleton. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us.